A few weeks ago we did a video on video game censorship, specifically in Australia. Why? Well, because Outlast 2 was the latest in a long line of video games to get banned by the Australian Classification Board until a different version of the game was resubmitted and then approved. Now, we only ended up making a video on it because Australian Senator David Leyonhjelm brought the issue up in Parliament, saying this:
"Not many senators or senior public servants would know the difference between a ghoul and an al-ghoul. Video games do not hurt anybody, and the government classification board should leave video gamers alone."
We thought that was pretty cool, so we made a video about it. Then, not long after that video went live, Mr. Leyonhjelm's team got in touch with us to ask if we wanted to interview the Senator ourselves to hear what he's got to say about video game censorship. Now, we're all about fighting on behalf of the consumer here at Pretty Good Gaming, so of course we said yes. So here it is, an actual bit of proper journalism from Pretty Good Gaming. I know. Video game censorship is a big problem in some countries, Australia included. Australia didn't have an R18 rating for video games until 2013. So, despite the National Classification Code stating that adults should be able to read, hear and see whatever they want. Since the R18 rating was introduced down under, 4 games have been banned and never released, while 5 games were refused at first, including State of Decay, Saints Row 4 and South Park The Stick of Truth, before an edited or censored versions of those games were later permitted. So, with that in mind, my first question to Senator Leyonhjelm was this: why, if you have a strict R18 rating, are some games still getting banned for things like drug use, violence and sexual violence, all themes that feature heavily in movies, for example?
That's a very good question.
Cheers.
There are some criteria that they apply: sex, violence, drugs, that sort of stuff, and bestiality, things involving children, those sort of criteria, and they're not very clear about exactly where they think the boundaries are. I don't defend the classification at all, but what I can say is it's better than it used to be. It used to be you couldn't get through it all. I suppose we should be grateful that things are moving in the right direction, but it's, you know, it's nothing near what I would prefer it to be. So
some games for adults are still getting banned, despite them being just that, games for adults. Which is insane, because it's an idea that's totally accepted when you're talking about movies. Some films are just for adults. So on to the second question. Is the problem the fact that the classification boards in some countries are just bogged down in the idea that video games are played mostly by children?
There's an implied acceptance of the idea that what you see in a video game you'll go and do in reality. You know, that underlines a lot of it. So you can watch sex in a video game, and then if you go and engage in sex, well, the censors think, well, that's okay, you can do that. You can even take drugs depending on, you know, what kind of drugs and what the circumstances are. But you can't go and have sex with an animal in a game, because the assumption is you'll go and have sex with an animal in reality. You know, it's ludicrous. We all know it's ludicrous. There's actually quite good evidence to show that you're less likely to go and do things you see in a video game as a result of playing the video game than more likely, and yet that doesn't seem to have penetrated to the censors. I wonder when we're ever going to reach a stage where that assumption is defeated. The best we can do at the moment is praise them for the fact that they're not as bad as they used to be.
But then I suppose you have to ask, how do censorship boards, classification boards, the people who apply age ratings to video games, entertainment, how and where do they draw the line on some things?
It's an independent censorship board. They're not subject to political direction, and they make up their own minds. They can be obviously lobbied. And that, you know, an industry representative organisation would be probably very welcome to those sort of people, to the people on the censorship board who would probably never heard from anybody from the gaming industry, certainly not as a collective voice. And but the likelihood is they are trying to apply what they think are objective criteria. They probably know very little about the community that enjoys games. They probably don't know much about the worldwide situation. They probably don't know very much about the kind of people who play video games. And I suspect they're working on assumptions that you and other people watching this would say, well, no, they're not right. It's not beyond saving. I don't think they're operating from the point of view of some doctrinaire religious perspective or saving the world from sin or something like that. I think they're probably operating on some sort of written criteria, but applying it in a way that is based on assumptions that you would challenge, fairly readily.
So games are still getting banned despite an R18 rating in place in Australia. So what the hell were things like before the R18 was introduced?
It got to a very silly stage where we had R18 for movies, so you could go to a movie and watch sex and violence and things like that, but you couldn't buy a game that had exactly comparable levels of sex and violence. There was quite a lot of pressure, particularly from the adult sex industry, to get that changed. And in fact, I chaired an inquiry, a nanny state inquiry, in the last Parliament in the Senate, where we looked at that. And that was not long after that it actually changed, as I recall. And we highlighted the stupidity of the fact that, what you could do, you could hire a video, a DVD, an R-rated one, and take it home and watch it, but you couldn't hire or buy a game which showed essentially the same sort of things.
And then on to something I felt was a pretty important question. What kind of message does this send out to the games industry? All those people who make games, who are invested in games, what kind of message does this send to them?
The consequences in terms of its commercial effect, its effect on industry, is not something that that too many people think about. We have a government that says, oh, they're all in favour of jobs and innovation, except that it depends on what kind of innovation you're talking about, and games are, not really thought about much at all. To some extent, that's a reflection of the fact that politicians are mostly older and have very little experience with games. Also, the gaming industry itself doesn't have a very loud voice in Australia. We don't hear from them very much.
And that's kind of a big problem, right? I mean, if the industry itself isn't talking up about this, who will? Now, this next bit is a very interesting point. What actually has to happen for video game censorship to be improved? What can the industry do? What can gamers do themselves to make sure that you don't get a situation where some countries' games are banned while the rest of the world gets to play those exact same games?
Well, the normal method, and probably the most likely method of succeeding on that, would be to establish an industry lobby group, an industry voice, a representative organisation that speaks up in support of the games industry, and talks about the jobs, the export potential, the fun people have, how it generates various social benefits. That's the sort of thing the other industry organisations do. I think the gaming industry has a good story to tell. There's not a lot of harm you can do sitting at home in your own lounge room playing on your computer. You're not out in the street getting in fights or driving cars around having accidents or any of the sort of traditional harms that people refer to. And so I think you got a very good story, plus, as I said, the economic benefits as well. I hear from lobby groups representing the alcohol industry, tobacco industry, gambling, but I never hear from gaming. Until I get some backup, until there's somebody else saying the same things, frankly, irrespective of what I say and do, nothing will change. What needs to happen is for the gaming industry to speak up. Then I can represent their views, I can get them in to see ministers, I can help them to amplify their message, I can arrange for them to get media attention. But me, by myself, just with my voice and nobody else's, is not all that effective.
Now, I should point out that Senator Leyonhjelm is a libertarian, so freedom of choice and freedom from the nanny state are all part of his political outlook. But regardless, his thoughts on video games are still pretty interesting, if only for the comparisons to movies and how they're treated by classification boards, and also the view that gamers are still seen as mostly children. Now, the idea of an industry lobby or a pressure group is also very interesting and does kind of reflect how new video games are as a medium, because currently that just doesn't exist. There's no pressure on politicians. There's no pressure at all on politicians in Australia as far as Senator Leyonhjelm sees it, and without that pressure there's no reason for things to change. There's no reason for laws to change, for guidelines for the classification boards to be adjusted. There's no reason for things to become more pro-gamer without gamers and the games industry advocating that. Until that does happen, until, like Senator Leyonhjelm said, that there is some pressure group or lobby established, we'll just have to deal with the fact that some countries like Australia, Germany, and even the UK in the past will have to do without certain games on some occasions, some rare occasions admittedly. It just sucks that some people might not be allowed to play a game purely based on where they live, while the rest of the world will get to enjoy that game no problem. So if you ever missed out on a game because of censorship in your country, let us know what it was down in the comments. Remember to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. There's some more content for you right here, and a link to Patreon if you want to support more cutting, incisive interviews like this. We'll see you next time.